Welcome to Portraits of AQSG with Lisa Erlandson, featuring members of the American Quilt Study Group. Join us as longtime members of AQSG share their memories, thoughts, and outlook for the future of quilt studies. American Quilt Study Group is a member-supported organization built on learning from each other since 1980. We connect quilt enthusiasts engaged in research and learning. Today I talk with Bets Ramsey of Nashville, Tennessee. Bets is a founding member of the American Quilt Study Group and presented a paper at the inaugural 1980 meeting. Bets co-directed the Quilts of Tennessee documentation project along with Mary Kay Waldvogel. She was inducted into the Quilters Hall of Fame in 2005. Bets is an artist first who then discovered a love for quilts and quilting. She has authored and co-authored several books. She has been published multiple times in Uncoverings, the annual research journal of the American Quilt Study Group. I am Lisa Erlandson, and this is Portraits of AQSG featuring Bets Ramsey. Okay, all right. Well, Bets, what first drew you to quilts?
First drew me. Well, it was sort of a fluke. I was already an exhibiting artist, and I had been working, teaching for a number of years, and then I decided to go to graduate school when my kids were older. So one of the classes I had to take was called Crafts in America. And the only thing on the list of subjects to choose from that had anything to do with textiles was quilts. And I didn't really like quilts, but I signed up for it because it was a historical survey course. And so I spent hours and hours in the library doing research and just really fell in love with quilt ideas, but didn't have a real connection to them quite yet. But I got Ickes' book, Quilt Making in America, not Quilt Making America, the Standard Book of Quilt Making and Collecting. And that was my Bible. I had that with me at graduate school, and I started making squares and just trying to figure out what quilting was all about. But of course, I was already involved in textiles, so that wasn't a big jump. So for my graduate exhibit, I had some large banners made from quilt designs and a lot of other things, surface design things. So that was my introduction to quilting, and then I went on after graduate school and continued teaching classes and just added that to my curriculum. So that was where we got started.
Everybody comes from such a different background when that question comes up. It's so interesting to find out where people come from. So looking at all that you know of quilt history and all the quilts and textiles that you've seen, what would you say is your favorite quilt or textile time period?
I think I like quilts from the 1840s period. They have such rich fabrics and unusual designs and just an exquisite needlework. Not every one, but of course some are beautifully made. But I also swing to contemporary art quilts, so I'm on the fence. I like all of them.
Nothing wrong with that at all. Nothing wrong with that. Well, let's talk about American Quilt Study Group, the purpose of our talk here today. So if I tell you you can only have one word, what one word comes to mind when I say AQSG?
Well, I have to say two words, Sally Garoot.
Oh, okay. All right.
It's really the beginning of it for me.
Yes, definitely. Well, I guess that leads us right into the next, which is When and how did you learn about AQSG?
Well, before AQSG existed, Sally Garrett came to Chattanooga to visit Charles Counts, who was an outstanding art quilter. He was one of the pioneers that really launched quilts in the 60s in abstract designs, and they were quite innovative. So she wanted to meet him, and she wanted to see the mountain ladies that sat around the quilt frame working on his quilts. And so she just thought this was a very unique experience for her. But Charles was a friend of mine, and so he brought her down and introduced her to me, and we became friends then. And within a year or two, she wrote or called. She called a lot, and she wrote and said she wanted to start this survey of interest to see if people were really enthusiastic about starting this group of study. So I went out to California for the first meeting, and the baby was born.
Wow. So you were in on it not at the beginning, you were in on it before the beginning.
Well, just a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, that is so wonderful. So you're a good person to ask this next question. Having known it, you've known AQSG all of its life. What do you value the most about AQSG?
Well, I think the friendships that we form when we start, of course, it was so primitive in the beginning. It was just like sort of going to camp, it was just very close-knit group. And of course, it's not like that anymore, but still this friendship exists. And the minute someone joins the group, they've immediately made friends.
Yes.
And I think that's the asset. Of course, the real purpose of it, I think, and it always is going to be central, is that of doing the research and writing the papers. And some people don't think that's the most important aspect of it, but I think it verifies our existence.
Yes, I think it does too. What has surprised you the most about AQSG?
Well, when we started out, we were such amateurs. We had no idea what we were doing. Sally had a firm grasp on what she envisioned, but she was a very unusual person, and she could project all kinds of future plans that she would like to initiate, but nobody else had quite the same concept she did. But I think that it would be totally startling for us, those first few people that were there, to see what it's like now, to see the fantastic research that goes on in the universities, and just the fact that you can get a PhD in quilt making is pretty unusual.
It is. And the AQSG has members now, not just in the United States. We have members all over the world.
Well, absolutely. Well, we did have a few international members from the very beginning, but it gradually grew more and more. And of course, travel is so much easier than it was back in those days.
Oh, and communication. It's, yes, so different. Well, what changes over the years, and this may be kind of a repeat of this last question, I don't know, what changes over the years in AQSG are you the most pleased with, that you look at and say, this is the best thing that's changed about AQSG?
Well, I think that people have come up with innovative ideas to enhance the seminars. But also, I think that starting these smaller regional groups has been a great asset, and it gives people something to think about in between yearly meetings.
Yes.
And again, it's the conditions in a small group are so much more rewarding than being in with 200 people or more.
Right, right. That's very true. Well, with all of that, is there anything from the very beginning that you think hasn't changed?
Well, but certainly the friendships that form and the willingness to share information. You know, some organizations are so secret about their discoveries and they don't want to share the glory with anybody else. But quilters are so generous about that, and they'll just, if you have a problem and you put word out that you need some help on it, you'll get all kinds of help, more than you need probably.
I agree. I agree with you. Well, I guess you've, over the years, well, you went to California for the first one, so I guess you've been to lots of seminars. So what is your most memorable moment at a seminar?
Well, this is a rather unusual. I don't have my quarterlies anymore, my annuals anymore, because I've given all of my papers to the Tennessee archives. So I don't know the years that these, some of these important meetings were for me, but this one was from the American Folk Art Museum in New York. And it was featuring Questa Benberry and Laurel Horton and me and some others. And the subject was African American quilts and American quilts. So it was a great opportunity because Questa very seldom gave talks. And this was one time when she just was all there with all of her vast knowledge and experience. And up to that point, she was a generalist. She was not just hanging on. It was later that she sent her concentration on African American quilts. She was much more historic for the whole breadth of quilt making before, up to that time. So it was unusual for her to be talking just about African American quilts. But the lectures were to be held in the auditorium of an organization for the blind. And when we went up to the podium, there was no light. There was no slide projector, slide forwarder. There was no real place to put your papers. There was a microphone that was on a sort of a wire, movable wire thing, but it came right up in the middle of the podium. So that's where your papers would have been. So it was a very tense situation. And we were so worried about our papers and our presentations. But we got through it all because we had to have people holding flashlights for us so we could read our papers and see what was going on.
That's pretty memorable.
That one was one that was nerve-wracking, to say the least.
I guess. Sounds like it. So which presentation that you've done for AQSG is the one that makes you the most proud, that you are the proudest of, your best work that you?
Well, again, I don't know the year of this. I think it was around 1993 that we met in Maine. Did we meet in Portland?
I think so. I'll have to check too. Yeah.
Well, if we didn't meet there, I don't know where it was, but I drove to Maine, and I was thinking that was where this talk was. Anyway, the talk itself was about quilt art quilting designers in the early in the middle 20th century, from about 1960 to 1980, I guess, sort of a pathway like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that was at a time that art quilts were not as big as they are now, of course.
Right.
And people didn't know the history of them very well. But I happen to have been a member of the American Craft Council, and knew a lot of art quilters that would show in there. In fact, I think I saw Michael James' first quilt at an ACC show. And so I went to New York, and I stayed with Marilyn Henryon. I don't know if you know her or not. She dropped out of AQSG because she became an independent artist and lives in New York. But I stayed with her, and I got to go to the American Craft Council library, which was just a few blocks from where she lived. And so I did all this wonderful research in New York, and got to meet New York quilt artists. So I was killing two birds with one stone. I was meeting contemporary artists as well as doing research on these early quilt makers. And Charles Counts was one of these leading artists. He was a potter. I don't know if you were familiar with him, but he was a world-renowned ceramist. He had studied with several people from the Bauhaus in California. And he liked to put on his ceramic shows, but he needed background filler for them. So he was living in North Georgia and had these quilt ladies all around him that would work on his quilts. And so he'd just dash off these monstrous sized quilts and had great attraction for his work.
Wow. Well, and that's another one. It's like the way people come to quilts is so different. You know, his was a very practical need for an art type quilt. So
well, one of the things that really worried Sally Garrett, he would stand over his quilt that was stretched on the frame, and he'd take a #2 pencil and draw right on the quilt. And of course, Sally thought that was just perfectly horrible. And these ladies had, they had no concept of this art stuff that they were working on, but they just knew to stitch and follow his lines, and it didn't bother them at all.
that's fun. So if you were, what's your favorite research topic? Not counting what you've done, but something that you think this would be my very favorite research topic, or maybe it's one that you have done.
Oh my. Well, I guess, if I were 25 years younger, I would want to go to Japan and study fabric there. And unfortunately, I would like to have done it 25 years ago, because things are so modern now that you don't get as much of the hand printing and hand dyeing that you used to. But I'm just nuts about indigo dyed Japanese fabric, and that would be, and I use it, I have it all the time, as you know, some of my work has it, but I would love to be able to be in that environment. But I think it's too late.
Well, maybe they'll invent, a transporter, and we can just transport you right over there, and you can do it, and then you can just transport right back and do your researching that way. So, well, that may be a good segue into this next one. What are we missing in AQSG? What research topic or topics do you feel that we haven't touched yet, that are, I don't want to say neglected in a negative way, but that we just haven't come up with a person that wants to do it or a way to do it? What are we missing?
Well, it's not something that we're lacking exactly, but but I'm impressed with the amazing research that's done and all the laboratory prep that we could never do in the past. You know, we would barely tell a linen thread from cotton, and just intricate fiber works and that sort of thing. But I hope that we don't lose sight of the stories that go with the quilts. So many of our early papers were about situations where it might have been a group of quilters from the same family, like Laurel Horton has done, and some things like that. But I think we mustn't forget that. We just want to include these families' histories, and of course, Mary Kay has done some wonderful research on family groups too.
That's good. That's good advice for all of us. So, if you were to meet somebody that had just joined AQSG, they're brand new AQSG member, what advice would you give to them?
Well, I would say just go for it. Go to the meeting, meet as many people as you can, find some that you really want to make friends with, and volunteer. And that's the way you get involved. And once you get your feet wet, there's no stopping you. So
it's very contagious, isn't it?
Yes, just don't be shy. Just introduce yourself and get acquainted.
All right. So what keeps you in AQSG?
I'm sorry?
What keeps you in AQSG?
It's my baby. It's something that is part of me. And I don't go to meetings anymore, but I keep up with what's going on and just want to encourage other people.
And you contribute to AQSG every year with your auction contributions. And, you know, so you keep your finger in the seminar, even though you're not there.
Oh, right. And I especially make a point of sending memorial gifts to people who were members and want to remember them. So that's a very long, lived process, you know, that it goes on and on.
Right. Well, especially when you may not have known every person that joined, but you've been a part of AQSG as long as there have been people joining it.
Right.
So you've had a chance to really know a lot of people and enjoy the richness of the organization.
Well, I have a little interesting side story. I don't know if you ever met Lucy Hilty.
No.
You know, she was one of the founders and just so active, such a fabulous quilter. Well, she had a friend in the Bay Area, Virginia McElroy, and Virginia and I became good friends during our seminars. And the last few years I went out there to visit my friends in Palo Alto. I would go into town and meet her at a museum and see her. So a few years ago, I started teaching a story writing class, sort of a memoir writing class. Mm-hmm. And Virginia has a husband and a son who are both homebound. Her husband had a stroke, and I don't know, her son is ill. So I know she was very tied down, but I thought she could join our story group and write. So we have several long-distance writers in our group, and she writes a story every week, every month, and we send them out to each other. We have 15 people in our group, and that's just one example of how life-saving you can be to someone who has sort of given up their contacts. Well, she meets with Julie and Ron every year to have an outing with them.
Mm-hmm.
But it has been a lifesaver to her. And she's just had 3 great-granddaughters born this same year.
Wow.
And she said, oh, I've really got to make some baby quilts. And so I said, well, why don't you just make each one of them a doll quilt? So that's what she's doing. So that is just a precious long life friendship that I've made through AQSG.
Yes. I see a quilt over your shoulder on the wall up there. Tell me about that quilt.
Um, Behind me, well, let me see. I have a the one on the well, the smaller one, I guess, is a Japanese obi, a section of an obi, and the larger one there is probably an 18th century French brocade or tapestry. I'm not sure what the technique is. That a friend of mine was a sculptor, but he also collected fabric, and so that came from him.
Beautiful.
Yes, it was.
For your
Well, it's been fun. I've enjoyed it.
It's been great. Thank you so much. And please thank Jim for helping to make this possible. And thank you so much for giving so freely of your time to not only this interview, but for everything that you continue to do for AQSG.
Well, you're so welcome, and it's my pleasure.
Thank you for joining us today. Visit us at AmericanQuiltStudyGroup.org. Find us on Facebook and Instagram. Look for more from the American Quilt Study Group on our YouTube channel. American Quilt Study Group is a nonprofit, member-supported organization dedicated to connecting quilt enthusiasts engaged in research and learning. Your donation supports study, research, and publication of work that enriches our knowledge and enjoyment of quilts. To learn more, make a donation, or to join us, please visit AmericanQuiltStudyGroup.org.